Good morning. I bring you greetings from Jerusalem, from Reverend Atik and all the people at Sabil in Jerusalem. And I greet you with the traditional Easter greeting, Christ is risen. Amen. That was not just a religious or a Christian or a Jerusalem or an Easter greeting. It is also at the heart of the message of Sabil, as well as at the heart of all of us, from whatever religious tradition or no religious tradition, who have been working for peace and justice for a long time. I see several familiar faces and quite a few new ones. And the familiar faces remind me of how long we have been working on this question and how sometimes we may feel discouraged that the odds are overwhelming against us. But that is precisely the message of Easter. That God is still sovereign. That the arc of history bends towards justice. That what appears on the surface to be impossible is in fact not only possible, but inevitable. And I want to give you a word of encouragement today, that we know, despite the utterly incredible imbalance, the forces that are amassed against the possibilities of a just solution, that such a solution is not only possible, but inevitable. Sometimes we need to be reminded of this, and sometimes we need to open our eyes like the prophet of old and to see that in fact it is so. And I want to give just a glimpse of 4 different things that help us remember that in fact there is a basis for this hope that we have. I do not need to tell this group much by way of information about the Palestinian-Israeli situation. But I would like to point to you these 4 things that have happened in the recent past, which point out to the possibilities of a fundamental change and shift towards the just peace that I refer to. Very briefly, first, the Arab Spring. You all know about it. It is significant not only because it fundamentally changes the power relationship between Israel and its neighbors, not only because it gives the Arab peoples a greater role in running their affairs, not only in that it makes their leaders no longer the easy, compliant stooges that allow the situation of the Palestinians to fester and continue, although it does all these things. It's significant because it shows us how very rapidly a situation can change, which festers for a long time, how very quickly, in a matter of weeks or months, situations that everybody thought were stable, completely unmovable, all of a sudden are turned. And that's always been the case in history. That's why people always get it wrong, especially the experts, the pundits, the analysts, who cannot see the fall of the Berlin Wall, who cannot predict the collapse of communism in the Eastern Bloc, who could not foresee the collapse of the Shah, of Idi Amin, of Hosni Mubarak, and many others, because they don't have the perspective that we have, that God is still sovereign in the affairs of people. Secondly, and very paradoxically, there is a major shift in Israel today. It is a shift towards the right wing. It is a shift away from principles of international law. It's a shift away from even the pretense of trying to be a Western-style democracy. It is a shift towards reliance on brute power that is no longer camouflaged by a pretense of wanting peace. Anybody who is familiar with what is said in Israel, in Hebrew as opposed to what is said abroad, is very aware of this change and how ultimately destructive it can be. Paradoxically, I say, that is also a sign of hope and of the change to come. Brings me to the third point. We see, even in this country, a movement away from the kind of support that Israel and its policies used to have. Oh, make no mistake about it. It is still powerful. AIPAC is still a powerful agency with money and access to power. But it no longer commands the minds and the hearts of people. Even within the American Jewish community, there is such a moral disgust with what is happening in their name in the Israel that they love. For many of them, that turns into just distancing themselves. They don't want to hear about it. They want to talk about it. It's no longer an important issue for them. There was a recent study that said less than 6% of American Jews consider Israel an important issue to them. Amazing. Absolutely amazing. But thank God for those American Jews who do still think it is an important issue and are willing, out of a moral commitment, out of their values and their tradition and their religious values, to take a position. The Jewish Voices for Peace, for example, and other groups. And a lot of people, reminds me of the Old Testament when Elijah thought, oh, I'm the only one who's left. And God says, there's 4,000 knees that did not bend to Baal. There are a lot of Jewish knees out there who are not bending to the idol of Israeli power, Israeli aggression, Israeli domination. And that, incidentally, was translated in 2 or 3 resounding defeats for AIPAC and its lobby over issues of appointments, as you know, of 3 major people, the last of whom was Hagel and Kerry, which they fought tooth and nail and failed. Not because people are particularly interested in justice or in the Palestinian issue or in even-handedness, but because the centers of power in the United States are getting sick and tired of being bullied by people who only know the language of power, who no longer even bother speaking the language of human rights, shared values, truly shared values, and moral commitment. 4th sign of hope: the major changes in the evangelical community in the United States. The changes that we have seen recently are phenomenal. A small group of evangelical and other Christians in the Palestinian community, and a large group of faithful evangelicals in this country have been working on their fellow evangelicals, reading the scriptures with them in a very conservative, theologically, stick with conservative way, have shown that Christian Zionism is not really what the Bible teaches. And that a Christian commitment, even for Orthodox conservative Christians, includes a commitment to justice and includes love for Palestinians as well as for Israelis, and includes a rejection not only of racism and anti-Semitism, but also of discrimination against Palestinians, and of apartheid, and of militancy and militarism and reliance on military power. When Jimmy Carter spoke about peace or apartheid, he was vilified not only because he used the word apartheid, but because he was an evangelical Christian, speaking the language that they understood. And he was saying, as a Baptist and an evangelical who takes the Bible seriously, even literally, I cannot support the occupation or its policies. This is major. This is ground shaking. These 4 points that I mentioned are just signs, glimpses of the kind of seismic changes that are taking place, that show that our message is true, and that show that indeed the arc of history is bending towards justice. But that doesn't mean that the battle is easy, does not mean that the battle is over, does not mean that we do nothing, does not mean that we don't have a difficult fight ahead of us, because we do. In much of the rest of the world, In Europe, for example, the issue on a moral, legal, ethical, philosophical basis has been pretty much won. Perhaps it's the United States that remains as the last bastion. Which means your task has now become paramount. You, like Sabil in Jerusalem, are in the belly of the beast. And the recent almost identity of interest between the power structures of empire in this country and Israel only confirm what I am saying. Drone attacks, the erosion of traditional civil liberties, the open reliance on power and power politics, ignoring and denigrating international law in every possible forum. All these are common elements, and they have to be fought, both in this country and in the Middle East. And they are important battles that ultimately are really spiritual battles. Spiritual battles, where you are the frontline warriors. So as you go about this fight, how do we do that? What do we look to? What are we afraid of? What are we worried about? You have a lot of potential allies in this country. There is a tradition here of activists who are principled, who have taken up the struggle that we need to reach out to, and that we need to embrace, and that we need to enlist, and whose solidarity is necessary in this struggle that we are conducting. And the other side knows it, and are putting a lot of effort and money in a very intentional way to prevent you from moving ahead. So as you move ahead, again, I have 4 items of advice that I hope you will take to heart. The first is avoid and insist on avoiding a false symmetry between the occupier and the occupied, the oppressor and the oppressed, the victim and the victimizer. Does not mean that we are not conscious of the horrific history of anti-Semitism culminating in the Holocaust and perhaps continuing in anti-Jewish sentiment. It's just a recognition that on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, there is no equivocation, no equivalency, there is no symmetry. It is not necessary every time you invite a Palestinian that you invite an Israeli. It is not necessary that anybody who dares talk about justice and peace needs to bring in what the oppressor feels, their excuses and their justification. There is right and there is wrong. Oh yes, we still recognize the humanity of people, just like we recognize the humanity and frailty of the slave owner as well as the slave. But that does not mean we equivocate when it comes to slavery. The issues involved here are clear, and they should be stated as such. Which brings me to the second point. We cannot accept the argument that there can be no peace except on terms that are agreeable to Israel or to the majority of Israelis. That is not true. Talk about negotiated peace all you want, but in the end, there is a power relationship that needs to be addressed. You can't just say, let them decide it by themselves. Let the wolf and the sheep make the proper arrangements of how to have dinner with no outside interference. That simply cannot be accepted. Yes, there is need for negotiations. Yes, there is need for understanding the proper human interests of both sides. But there is no right to dictate up front, and there is no right to veto solutions simply because the oppressor does not accept it. This idea of veto is very interesting. People in the peace and justice community love the idea of consensus. Let's all agree. Consensus is nice, but you must understand what consensus means. It means every individual has veto power over the group. You should confront that. And you should be willing to tell, I mean, let's face it. People who are sympathetic to Israel, including many liberal Jews, are very active in many of the causes that you're active in. Anti-nuclear, anti-apartheid, social justice, gay rights, you name it. They're involved in all of these communities. We cannot allow them to be used to stymie and paralyze these groups from taking a position on Israel and Palestine. Third, if you're really working for peace and justice, you must not be afraid to be criticized. You must not try to please everybody and avoid upsetting people. If you want to avoid upsetting people, you shouldn't be in the business of being prophetic. Prophets always upset people. Prophets are always criticized. And now they have new names. They have new epithets to use against you. Not just anti-Semitic. Now you are delegitimizing Israel. That's the new word. You cannot delegitimize Israel. We are delegitimizing racism. We're delegitimizing the occupation. We're delegitimizing oppression. And we should delegitimize them. I never tire of saying in a Christian audience that there is a special blessing in Matthew. Blessed are you if they say all manner of things against you falsely for my name. So if you are vilified and critiqued, remember, it has to be falsely, then you get a blessing. If you are anti-Semitic, if you really hate Jewish people, you don't get a blessing. Sorry. None. You must do it out of genuine love for both Jews and Palestinians. You must be prepared to do that. And if you do, and if you're vilified, and if you're run out of your university or college, or if you get all these nasty emails, or if you get bumped off of a city council or a particular position, or if you get run out of the particular committee of activists that you are involved in because you take positions on BDS and other things, you have a blessing, a special blessing. Finally, point number 4, some humility. We need to avoid the trap into which all of us have been falling, myself included, over the years, of trying to find the solution. What is the solution? What is the Holy Grail? Is it 2 states, 1 state, Oslo process, this process, that process? And we get into thousands of hours of debate among ourselves into the late hours of the night, trying to find that Holy Grail, the perfect solution, which then presumably each of us will take back to their community and try to convince a majority or try to convince those who are in power to adopt. Some humility here. Leave something for God to do. You are not called upon to solve the Palestinian-Israeli question. You must start with that. You're called to obedience. You're called to be a testimony and a witness for truth and justice and for reconciliation. You're called to love people, and you're called to work against torture, against the wall, against the settlement, against militarism, against drones, against more weapons, against suicide bombings, against corruption, against human rights violations, no matter who does them. You are not called upon to be the new Kissinger. You are not called upon to solve this problem. Leave something for God to do. A little humility, I think, will go a long way. A long way. Because if you fall into the trap of finding the right solution, you spend all your energy arguing about it and discussing it and debating it and not really working. Let's say, okay, I don't know what the solution is. I do know that violence isn't the solution. And I'll work against violence from both sides, from any side. I do know that international law is a good thing and respect for human rights. So I'll work against violations of human rights. I do know that discrimination is not proper, is not right, is not good. That apartheid and apartheid-like systems are evil and sinful and ought to be opposed. I do know that domination is no good. I do know that security does not come from these 1,000,001 measures that humiliate and oppress and suppress your enemy. They don't work. That's your agenda. That's where you work on, not on trying to find the solution. You don't have the power to impose it anyway. You don't have the power to implement it. But you can be truthful to what you believe in. You can be truthful to the principle that you hold true, and you can find a lot of support. On the other side, you can find a lot of support on a huge variety of people, organizations who can be in solidarity with you and who can work with you on these issues. Don't demand or expect that everybody will agree with you ultimately on what needs to be done, because they won't. And they don't have to. Different people are willing to do different things. Some are willing, like Rachel Corrie, the Ecumenical Accompaniment Group, CPT, ISM, and others, to be on the front lines and to be real warriors on the ground and put their life on the line. Others are willing to urge their communities and their churches to simply refrain from benefiting from the occupation and the wall and the settlements by divesting from those companies that invest in those things. Some are willing to boycott. And then you get into the big debate. Are you boycotting only settlements, or are you boycotting Israeli goods generally? Everyone is at a different place. And you should not vilify one another. You should accept and respect one another. But certainly you should boycott. And certainly you should sanction. And certainly you should speak truth to power. And certainly you shouldn't let people get away with things. Just because some people boycotted Jews during the dark period in Germany and Europe and before, does not mean that boycott is no longer a legitimate weapon. We use it all the time in all sorts of struggles. It is not off the table just because one side doesn't want it to be on the table. The right of return is a legitimate issue. It cannot be just shoved under the rug or kept off the table because the other side refuses for you to even talk about it, because they just close the books the minute you mention it. We should be willing to stand firmly for what we believe in. And we believe in those things not because we are pro-Palestinian or anti-Israeli, but because they flow from who we are, our faith, our commitment to peace and justice, our vision for a better future for both people. And this is something we believe in, and therefore we work towards. And we should have no reason to be apologetic about it. Certainly not to people who don't believe in nonviolence themselves. I was asked recently, what is not acceptable in our struggle for peace and justice? What is off the table? What tactics are really not allowed? And they thought that I would mention boycotts and BDS as being... No! What's off the table is suicide bombings and drone attacks. That's what's off the table. What's off the table is preemptive strikes against Iran. That's off the table. What's off the table is a continuation of the present policy under whatever title you mention. That's off the table. Everything else is on the table, including critiques and criticism of the Palestinian National Authority and their pathetic performance. Sometimes I think that part of the role of the peace and justice community is also to critique our leaders for what they fail to do and for their complicity ultimately in the continuation of the occupation. Don't spare us because we are the victims. We are all under God's judgment for doing or failing to do what is righteous, what is just, and what is good. So, you have your fight, you have your battle, you have your work set for you, but please remain hopeful and confident. Ultimately, we will win, because the arc of history bends towards justice. There will be justice, and there will be peace and reconciliation ultimately. Thank you.